Tonight, Cassie Jaye, the maker of the Red Pill movie, joins me to discuss egalitarianism, gender relations, and the men's rights movement. I'm roaming millennial, and you're watching Uncensored. So, Cassie, thank you so much for joining us today. I have been a huge fan of your work since I first saw the Red Pill movie, and just hearing about all of the trouble you had to go through to get it screened places and the amount of people who I think kind of misrepresented what your mission was, that really resonated with me, and I'm glad that you've stuck with it and continue to do what I think of is important work.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me on your show.
Yeah, no problem. I've been wanting to do this for a while, so I'm glad it's happened. And I was thinking the first thing we could talk about to maybe kick things off is what got you interested in advocacy and specifically men's rights in general. I know you've spoken a bit about this before, but for anyone who's perhaps not familiar with your work, and I mean, there's probably nobody out there by now, hopefully, since you've been really blowing up. But you know, what was it that made you look, I guess, at the state of men's rights and equality between the genders and think maybe it's time for me to start speaking up about this?
Well, I really kind of fell into it, and that's why the rabbit hole imagery of Alice in Wonderland falling down the rabbit hole as the first red pill poster concept we had was very accurate to what actually happened to me. I stumbled down the rabbit hole into the men's rights movement because I was searching for my next film topic, and all my previous work was about women's issues or LGBT rights, and so I was really kind of known in that world. And in 2013, I was looking for my next feature documentary, and rape culture was just flooding my newsfeed. It was really around the Steubenville rape case, and there was also a gang rape on a bus in India that got a lot of worldwide attention. And so I was reading into this, and I was thinking, I'm going to make a film about rape culture, and that's really where I started. And when I started looking into it and Googling around and looking on the feminist websites that I followed, like Jezebel and feministing.com, I would see them blame the men's rights movement for rape culture, that they were perpetuating rape culture. And so I thought, well, what is the men's rights movement? And then I found a voiceformen.com, which at the time in 2013, it was the largest and fastest growing online hub of men's rights activists and blogs and forums. And they really were pretty smeared in the media. The very little media attention that they got just demonized them. And so I started looking on their website and reading around. And at that time, I was offended by what I was reading because I was a feminist of many years, and I was being triggered. And I thought, you know what, instead of making a film about rape culture, I'm going to make a film about the men's rights movement. No one had ever interviewed them on camera before and put them in a film. And that was the starting point, the journey down the rabbit hole, I guess.
And it's been, I mean, yes, quite a journey for you since then. And I'm glad you're talking about the whole idea that men's rights movements, you know, it's not just that they're not given attention, but when they are, they're, I think, actively vilified. And I think we've seen just recently the Southern Poverty Law Center did a piece about the men's rights movement and activists, and it was very, very negative toward it. I think it essentially tried to paint them as a men's supremacy movement. They even took in people like Christina Hoff Sommers talking about her and tried to, I guess, you know, associate her with male superiority or supremacy, which, I mean, I'm a huge fan of hers, and I think the idea that someone could listen to what that sweet lady is saying and think of her as some sort of male supremacist or chauvinist is ridiculous. But what do you think is causing that hostility toward these movements? Why are people, you know, generally people who perhaps subscribe to feminism themselves, so hostile to talking about equality for men, and not just superiority, but actual, you know, equality? We want everyone to be treated equal.
Yeah, well, I definitely in the mainstream world, whether it's in Hollywood or in, you know, mainstream news media, they really do demonize the men's rights movement and kind of have these blanket statements that they're anti-women, they're anti-women's rights, they're trying to turn back the clock on women's rights. And I mean, certainly if you go on some, you know, forums and where people are anonymous and are writing outlandish comments. First of all, you can't even assume that what they're saying is what they actually believe. There are a lot of people who troll around and just try to offend people. But I think the mainstream media is trying to, find one comment where they say something that is, horrific sounding by an anonymous troll, and then paint the whole movement as if that's the representative of the whole movement. And what I did with the Red Pill was I went to the people who men's rights activists considered their spokespeople, their representation, whether it's Warren Farrell or Aaron Pizzey or Karen Strawn or Paul Elam of A Voice for Men. And so I went to the who we would think are the leaders of the men's rights movement, who are open with their identity and they will back what they say. And, you're welcome to challenge what they say, but I think the problem with the mainstream media is they don't even invite them onto mainstream media sources to debate their views. Instead, they just write them all off based on some anonymous comments online. And so when I went to the leaders and really started to listen to what their views are and what legislation they want to pass and where they see men falling behind in society or being outright discriminated against, there is very little you can challenge when you dig into the data and see the suicide rates that roughly 80% of all suicides around the world are men, which is a symptom of something going on for men. And boys falling behind in education and homelessness and male victims of domestic violence not having any resources to go to. I mean, just right now, there's, I think, now 2 domestic violence shelters in the United States, and there's over 2,000 that accept female victims and only 2 that are for male victims. And the CDC reports that domestic violence is roughly the same. I mean, it's about 43% of all victims of domestic violence that have reported being abused are male. And we also have to, of course, consider the stigmatization of men not usually considering themselves a victim because we don't see that talked about. And so a lot of men don't even think of themselves as victims if they are having objects thrown at them or being hit by their partner and being stabbed. I mean, all these different stories that are horrific that they still don't think of themselves as victims because we just don't talk about that.
Right. And I think it's very important to, tell men that they don't need to be ashamed of coming forward if they are in these situations. They don't need to feel like they've been emasculated or anything. There's nothing, I think, that should be stigmatized about being a victim of abuse, whether you're male or female. And I really hope that on a personal, individual level, we can work on that so that men do feel comfortable going forward. But I think it's interesting that, and I'm sure you've heard about this, it's not, and you mentioned it too, it's not just that men themselves may be, hesitant, but there are actually, I think, institutional barriers that exist for male survivors of domestic abuse to actually get the help that they need. We've seen that in the past when news of male shelters has been announced, that feminists have been very vocally upset and have tried to, block or even harass the people who are behind it. And what do you think drives that? Are they operating from the position that the more resources that are spent on men, the less there are for women? How did this association that domestic abuse equals man beating up women, how did that even come to be? Because like you said, when we look at the stats, it's not a representation of reality.
Yeah, I mean, oh gosh, there's so much so many directions I could go with this. One thing I do want to say that the more I've thought about tribal mentality and movements and indoctrination and ideology, you have to identify a common enemy. And I do think that the more that feminists can say that there is an enemy against them and identify that enemy, the more funding and support and this heightened state of crisis that people will feel to want to go and support those movements or have Hollywood media campaigns around that. I think it's really unfortunate because what it should be is a campaign against perpetrators of violence or assault, regardless of gender, race, orientation, age, any of that. And because, the gender, race, orientation of perpetrators is all across the board. You cannot, say they're all one thing. And I think that's the problem with, feminism, is that they really are trying to paint a broad brush. And it's so frustrating because when I was a feminist for about 10 years, the whole thing was that you as a woman don't want to be painted with a broad brush, that all women are XYZ. You want to be looked at for the content of your character and be an individual and be valued for your mind and your talents and whatever else you contribute to the world. And so I hope more feminists will see that what they're doing to men, they wouldn't want done to them as a group, to be talked about, women as a group, in the way that they talk about men as a group. And it's just, I think we have a long way to go, and I hope the film, helps with that, redirecting us and to really just value each other as people and respect each other and hopefully come together again.
I think it's already started doing that. I mean, you've really started this huge, I would say, international conversation. And I mean, something that I think is very relevant in regards to this whole idea of actual treating people, equally regardless of gender, and not trying to, I guess, inflict our preconceived notions about who might be perpetrator, who might be victim, is the whole instance of the, I guess, #MeToo phenomenon. I know you've spoken out about that, and I believe what you said before is that falsely accused people are victims as well, which I know
Yes.
that I believe is true, but it was met with some controversy from some people who disagree with you. And I would like to ask you a little bit about what that means to you when you say that, because I think we've seen that, with the whole idea that we should listen and believe everyone who comes forward, the idea that we've seen from a lot of campus cases where they've reported sexual assault is that, there's not always the idea of innocent until proven guilty. So what are your thoughts on that? And for people who, I guess, are looking at maybe your opinions and mine as well, and thinking a little bit, well, don't we want people to feel comfortable coming forward? I mean, like, what are we all of a sudden supposed to be perpetuating rape culture and letting perpetrators get away with it? What would you say to them to try and make them see, I guess, your position about the whole innocent until proven guilty thing, maybe?
Well, I absolutely believe that any kind of form of sexual abuse is a very difficult topic to create legislation around that will help every person in every case scenario, because a lot of these instances happen between two people behind closed doors without any witnesses, with very little evidence. I mean, there's a lot of difficulties for police officers and investigators to find and identify and rightfully convict someone who really did something wrong. So I absolutely understand the need and one of victims to be able to share their story and to find compassion or sympathy or resources before there is absolute evidence to convict someone. And as far as resources, I mean, going to, a shelter if you need to find a place to get away, or if you're confiding in friends or family, where I think victims go a little too far. And of course, by victims, I say someone who's alleged victims, that they are saying that they're a victim and haven't, we don't have the evidence to know for sure yet. I think they're going a little too far by making it a public statement where now these people who are being accused, usually men and public figures in the Me Too campaign, they are having their reputations and their legacy just wiped and overshadowed by this allegation that hasn't been proven to be true yet in due process. And so I think we do need to look at the falsely accused as victims as well, because they are, if they're falsely accused, and this is something I talked about in my TEDx talk, is that when I was hearing men's rights activists talk about men falsely accused of rape or sexual assault, I would twist those words in my head into thinking that they were dismissing or diminishing the horror of a woman who is actually raped or abused. And it took me a long time actually looking through the footage and transcribing the audio to get that they were saying falsely accused. You have to remember the word falsely. Mm-hmm. Falsely. These are innocent people that are having either their children taken away, their job taken away, their entire reputation, their life's work, their legacy, just brushed over with this allegation. So, you know, I really feel for men who've gone through that, and I've heard from so many people through the making of the Red Pill, all these college men who've been wrongfully accused, lost their scholarship, and basically chased out of school, had to go somewhere else because of the repercussions of that allegation. And, you know, for people who dig into the false accusations on college campuses, they do see that it's kangaroo courts, that they are not treating male college students with the same respect and dignity and human rights that we would hope to see in you know, outside of the college system. So yeah, that's a big rabbit hole. There's so many issues that you could, you know, make films about each one of these issues.
Definitely. And I think what's interesting about what we're seeing right now with, you know, all of these movements, Me Too, Time's Up, and just, I guess, what's going on in Hollywood, but also, I mean, in pretty much every walk of life, you don't need to be a celebrity for this to happen to you, is sort of the effect of social media and what that has on all of this, because what we're seeing right now is that a lot of these allegations, they're not, you know, they're not really even being handed over to the police or to the court system, where things can be investigated. A lot of the time, we're seeing this in Hollywood, these accusations are just kind of thrown out there on social media, which is hard because I think you kind of come into the issue of everyone being judge, jury, and executioner, and because this isn't being brought to actual, you know, police or someone who can conduct an investigation about this, there's really not a whole lot of recourse, right? If you're actually being tried for a crime you didn't commit, I think, yeah, there's a good chance it may not be an equal hearing, but at least you can say perhaps justice will work. But for a lot of these men right now, when someone says something on an Instagram post or something like that, what we've seen with Me Too, I'm not saying that anyone is or is not lying. I don't know what's happened for really any of these cases. I haven't been there. But for a man who might be in that position, what would you advise him to do? Is there anything that he could maybe do to try and defend himself, take back control of the narrative surrounding his work? And of course, this is assuming that what happened isn't accurate.
Yeah. Well, I think what's so sad for a lot of these men who are falsely accused is that we don't punish false accusers. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is because a lot of feminist lobbyists have voted against that because they feared that actual victims would fear coming forward if false accusers are prosecuted. And I mean, there's so many levels of how that it wouldn't be the case, because it's already very difficult to convict something of a crime, but you have to have evidence. So if someone was a false accuser and there wasn't evidence, most likely they wouldn't have, you know, have a sentence or a fine or something like that if there isn't evidence showing that they falsely accused. So I personally do believe that we should have legislation to prosecute false accusers. But right now we don't. And, you know, the men who are being falsely accused, and I say men because it is very largely men, and if a woman is falsely accused, she usually won't see the same kind of backlash that a man accused would. And there was a woman in Sacramento who was one of the main champions of the Me Too campaign in Sacramento, and she was accused of sexually assaulting one of her employees. I believe it was grabbing his back and his front parts, and there was not the same kind of outrage over this, and she is a woman who's really heading the Me Too campaign there, and so we don't see the same kind of vilification and ostracization of women who are accused of something that we do of men. And you know, a lot of these Me Too stories, so whether it's James Franco or Aziz, when you really start digging into what the alleged female victims are claiming, I mean, they don't have a strong foundation to stand on with their stories, but then whether it's Time or Vice or The Guardian will just post all the pictures of all the men in Hollywood accused of something and just lump them all together like they're all the same. And James Franco is not the same as Harvey Weinstein.
And I think Matt Damon got in trouble for making a comment that's similar to that, kind of alleging that, or saying that, you know, there are a lot of accusations out there, but not all of these are the same, right? I mean, like, forcing yourself on someone, perhaps in Kevin Spacey's instance, forcing yourself on a teenage boy is not the same thing as, sending inappropriate text to a 17-year-old, or I forget exactly what it was that James Franco did. But I personally agree with that statement, and it's not to say that, oh, it's fine. He was just trying to solicit a teenager. Who has it, right? It's not to say that. But at the same time, we can't really talk about the fact that perhaps we shouldn't vilify all these people I guess, at the same amount without almost seeming like a rape apologist to some people.
Yeah, and I agree with what Matt Damon said about there being a spectrum of these stories, and we should not lump them all together. And unfortunately, he got so much flack for that I think he ended up saying something like, well, I'm just going to sit back here and be quiet and not say anything else about this. And that's really all guys can do now, or anyone who's trying to speak out against the mainstream narrative about the Me Too campaign or Time's Up. If they challenge or critique any little aspect of it, they will be shouted down, and there are real repercussions for that. And it's so crazy to me because I consider myself a liberal. And, I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I'm now 31, but when I was around 17, 18, I became a feminist. And part of the reason why I've leaned left is because I always saw it as the party for free speech and for science. And now I don't see that being the case. I mean, the left is engaging in censorship. And I saw it with my film. We had multiple screenings that were scheduled and booked for the theaters, and then radical feminist groups would protest and have these petitions with thousands of signatures and send them to the venues, the theaters, and basically bully them into pulling the film, which the theaters did. And I can't really blame the theaters because they were afraid for their own business, that people were saying we're never going to return to your theater and we're going to protest it and make sure no one else comes to your theater. So, I mean, it's really just bullying into censorship.
Right, and I think that's kind of what has shocked me, not the most, because a lot of things shock me about this, but one of the things that has been so surprising to me is the amount of vitriol that your film has been received with, because I heard about all of the controversy surrounding it before I actually saw the film itself. I ended up watching it on Amazon, and then my main takeaways were sort of, wow, this is a very well made film. It even, I consider myself an egalitarian, but it's even brought up points that I hadn't considered yet in terms of gender dynamics. But also, the other thought I had was, have these people complaining even seen it? Because it really does seem like they're talking about a different film than the one I saw. Do you think the people who criticize you like that, the feminists who try to get you kicked out of theaters, do you think they've actually seen your work and are familiar with your work and what you're trying to say, or do you think it's just reaction?
I know most of them have not seen the film because the statements that they make, there's just no way anyone who saw the film in its entirety could make those claims about me or the film. But I credit a lot of the misinformation and the smear campaign against me. I credit that to the very first review that came out of the film in the New York newspaper called The Village Voice, and they had to write a review. We needed it to qualify for the Oscars. You have to get reviews in New York and LA papers. And there was a radical feminist blogger that immediately reached out to the reviewer before he posted the review and fed him all this misinformation, got him to print it, and that was what set the stage for every other mainstream media source like Vice and The Guardian to just be on that script. And it started with a lie, and it just snowballed. And the main lie that they try to use to discredit myself or the film is saying that it was funded by its very subjects, that it was funded by MRAs. And the reason they're doing that is because I did a Kickstarter campaign for finishing funds for the film, just for post-production, because I funded the entire filming process for 2.5 years out of my own pocket, as well as my now fiance and my mother. The three of us funded it. And we ran out of funding for post-production, which is very expensive. So we turned to Kickstarter. We had over, I think, 2,000 backers that included feminists and included men's rights activists and mostly people who just supported free speech. And I know it was mostly people who supported free speech because my feminist friends and my, like the men's rights activists that knew about the film, right when the Kickstarter launched, the first 2 weeks, I think we had less than 20% of the funds that we needed raised just from the feminists and men's rights activists that knew about the Kickstarter. And then we got a surge of, we were actually written in Breitbart, which led a lot of people to hearing about the film and wanting to stand up for free speech. And anyways, long story short, none of the Kickstarter backers had any control, creative control, or, final cut viewing of the film. And it was entirely my own creation. And the Village Voice used that Kickstarter against me to say, look who funded it, which included feminists. So you could say feminists funded the film as much as you could say men's rights activists funded it. But, I'm glad that I did the Kickstarter because that was really the only way I could keep creative control. And there's so many filmmakers that lose creative control by going to these studio productions. And I know all these different feminist documentaries that are funded by advocacy organizations, and you cannot say that they're unbiased. But, it's one of those things where it's like, I don't even know if I could go back in history how I could have changed that, because we needed to complete the film. It wasn't going to be done without funding, and we had to do this crowdfunder, which thank goodness for crowdfunding today, because it's how people like you and me get to produce our own work and not have to answer to a studio or some big, media head that you're just a puppet for,
Definitely.
So
I'm really sorry that people have been saying those things about your film, and as someone who does, like you said, rely on crowdfunding, I've also had those kinds of allegations run at me, like, oh, you're just funded by Nazis who like you as a talk, like, people are going to say whatever they're going to say, but I think perhaps a silver lining to that is, looking back in hindsight, I'm sure it didn't seem like there was a silver lining as this was all happening, is the fact that I think it has actually ended up bringing even more attention to your work, which I think is a good thing. And I'm glad that I found out about it from these types of people who were trying to slander it, and I hope that they can appreciate that they led me to watch your film and become a supporter. So that's what they've accomplished there.
I appreciate that.
Something that I want to touch on quickly is the idea of, I guess, men's rights internationally. And you have mentioned that this isn't a Western issue when we look at rates of suicide, deaths in the workplace, homelessness, the idea that this disproportionately affects men, and not to a small degree, but an overwhelming degree. It's really universal. And this is something that I've actually sort of not struggled with myself, but I've kind of had to re-examine how I think about things like international aid, because I've criticized modern third wave feminism in the West a lot, and I've always said as an asterisk to myself, but places like Saudi Arabia and those developing countries, they actually do need a real egalitarian feminism. But then something that I'm realizing more and more is that, well, yes, women are persecuted there, but that's not, there are so many persecuted groups that exist in countries like that, and we actually do have special programs, women's outreach in places like the Middle East and Africa, but I do worry that in terms of the international aid spectrum or landscape, that men are being left out. And that's not to say that screw the women and the children, but I guess how would we make sure that we are looking at aid and trying to help people from as an egalitarian standpoint as we possibly can, not leaving any groups behind when we're trying to improve things?
Yeah, and you bring up great points. That, there are a lot of women's issues internationally that need to be looked at and supported and advocated for, and that's why I say I'm no longer a feminist, but I absolutely still support women's rights. And I would love to see female genital mutilation outlawed in all countries, and women, not just in Iran, a woman was sentenced to 2 years in prison for removing her hijab, because since 1979 they have a law in the books that women have to cover their hair, and she was doing it in protest, and usually it just leads to 2 months in prison, but this one about a week ago led to her being sentenced to 2 years in prison. So those are issues that I really do think should be looked at, and feminist groups who are truly saying that they're for women all around the world should be looking at those issues and put aside the mansplaining and manspreading issues for a second, and let's talk about those issues. But you're right, there are a lot of issues for men in those countries as well that should be looked at. And one chapter in the Red Pill movie that kind of talks about this is the Boko Haram section, where I'm not going to spoil the film for those who haven't seen it, but it's definitely one of the most horrifying chapters in the Red Pill movie, and it talks about how it's not just women or girls that are being victims of these radical Islamic groups. And when men are the victims, or boys in this case, it's overlooked and it's not talked about, and we don't see, the White House holding up a Bring Back Our Boys campaign. So, yeah, I think we need to. I think we just need to be cognizant and aware that men and boys have issues too, and they shouldn't be put on the back burner because we need to focus on women's equality right now. That's so much what I would hear from feminists while I was interviewing them for the Red Pill, is they would say, we're still trying to get up to women's equality right now, so let's hold off on the male victims of domestic violence or suicide rates. We're just trying to get our own equality right now. And now that I look back on that, it's like, why do we have to put anything on the back burner? These are all people right now living in flesh and blood right now that need to be cared about and supported. And I don't think there should be a line of who can be first in line to be cared about.
Yeah, no advocacy or human rights for you. Just we're focusing on the women first. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course I get that there is, because I've tried to. This is something I've been mulling over. Is it shouldn't be a zero-sum game, that caring about men's issues shouldn't neglect or make issues worse for women. But I do understand that there are limited taxpayer dollars, and that's where it can get tricky. Is I think that's why we do see feminists framing this gender war in the way that they do, that men are the enemy, and maybe it is a way to step on their shoulders to get higher up to the taxpayer dollars. I don't know, but it's it's not good for everyone as a whole to be having this war with each other.
For sure. And actually, concerning wars with each other, the last thing I wanted to talk about and ask you was a little bit about personal relationships between men and women, because you've spoken about, I guess, your own relationship with your fiance, being a little bit candid about, the how you might have felt before in the past, with things like getting more housework than he did, but actually, that doesn't mean that the man's not helping around the house just because he's not doing something like laundry or dishes. And I think that's actually something that I've related with a lot myself as well. I know when I first started dating, I was always very critical of a boyfriend who, wasn't caring, thoughtful, considerate, didn't do things like, not necessarily the monetary value of it, but want to do things like surprise someone with a present, or just do something to make the other person feel special. And it wasn't until I actually got into my 20s where I kind of turned and looked at myself and thought, well, what are you doing to make them feel special, right? I mean, do boys and do men not like feeling that way too? Do they not feeling like they're being cherished and heck, maybe even spoiled? So I really appreciate your perspective on that. And I was wondering, is there any relationship advice you might give to a young man or a young woman, and maybe you can talk about whether the advice would be different or the same, who's hoping to make a relationship work as an equal partnership, someone they can, I guess, share responsibilities in life with, and kind of just make things work as a team?
Well, something that really did help me in my relationship with my now fiance is putting myself in his shoes, or imagining putting myself into his gender role that we've developed and kind of just fell into in our own relationship, how we divided chores or bills and how we relate with each other. And when I started to put myself in his shoes, I realized, wow, I am the privileged one in this relationship, in my view, because I love the flexibility to pursue my career passions and not have to worry about being the majority breadwinner to pay the bills. And I love not having to do manual labor. He works in the film industry. He's a gaffer and a director of photography, and being a gaffer and a grip especially is a very taxing on the body kind of job. And so when he got home from work, and I also got home from work for my cushy day job, and I used to complain to him about, why do I have to do the laundry and cook? What I didn't realize was that he was, lifting upwards of 100 pounds throughout the day and on his feet for 12 hours and got 5 hours of sleep. And, I had a much more comfortable position. And so I think when you really start to put yourself in your partner's shoes, you can find the ways that you much prefer the role that you have. And then you will appreciate what they're providing and contributing to your household. And if you do that experiment and you still think that I'm doing more and my partner needs to pull their weight or something, then that's where you have a conversation about it and really do also some soul searching and see if you don't still have the chip on your shoulder about something, and have them present their case in obviously a very respectful way of what they think they're contributing and how. The thing is, it's not apples to apples. We're not talking about two identical people having, a checklist of hours and things that they're doing and how difficult it is or how much time it takes, because taking out the trash is not the same as doing the laundry. Maybe taking out the trash is quick, but if you have to go through the snow or through spider webs to get outside of the trash can, I'd much prefer to do the laundry, even though it takes longer.
With garbage water, yeah.
Yeah. So, I think we just have to communicate better and really be open to understanding the other person's perspective. And if you want to try an experiment and switch roles with your partner and see if you like it more, try it. Now my fiance and I kind of have switched gender roles in the past year, because I've been working a lot more and I needed him to help me around the house and help me with, filming, doing these interviews and all that. And, I, in a lot of ways, I kind of wish I still had my previous position of him being the majority breadwinner, because it's difficult to be the primary provider. There's a lot of pressure. And, I think that's something that a lot of guys don't talk about, husbands and fathers, because they do want to be the provider. And, I think a lot of them just really want to make their wife or their children happy, and they don't want to complain to them about how hard it is to do what they do. So a lot of women don't even understand what they're going through because they don't talk about it. So, I really hope that millennials can get back on track with harvesting healthy relationships, because that is our future, and that's definitely the next generation's future, is having healthy relationships between men and women and their families, and to have children in loving, happy households. And to raise children, you do need to have some kind of division of roles. And the film I made before the Red Pill was about gay marriage, and I followed a gay family for a few years and their adopted kids, and they had very defined gender roles. There was a breadwinner who was also a cop and a veteran, and there was a stay-at-home dad who cooked and cleaned and was a part of the PTA and was very nurturing and loving, and that's what works.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for sharing all that insight. And I think any message that tries to increase the amount, of sympathy that we have for each other, trying to empathize, put ourselves in the other person's shoes can only be a good thing. And for anyone who hasn't seen the movie yet, where can they find it? Because I know it's available, thankfully, on quite a few platforms now. And even more importantly, where can they find you and keep up with what you're doing?
Thank you. They can watch the Red Pill movie on Amazon Prime. I really like Amazon Prime. Go there. But it's also available on Hulu and iTunes and YouTube and Vudu and Google Play and a bunch of other places everywhere but Netflix, because Netflix did not want it. They were in negotiations and they decided to drop it for, I'm sure, political reasons. I can't say that on record, but that's my theory. And but yeah, all the places you can find the film is listed on theredpillmovie.com, and you can follow me on Twitter at Cassie_Jaye, Jaye, and Facebook and Instagram and everywhere else, YouTube. Oh, and I'm also releasing what I call the Red Pill Raw Files, which is deleted, unseen, never before seen footage from the making of the Red Pill that didn't make it into the final movie. So that's on my YouTube channel, the Red Pill Raw Files.
I've been seeing you post tweets about that. Are there any other, I guess, maybe upcoming events or upcoming projects you have later this year that we should be on the lookout for?
Oh, I have so many ideas and I haven't committed to one yet. So I can't announce what I'm doing next until I know for sure this is the one, but I'm pretty sure I know what I want to do next, and I'm gonna start it right after I get married in June. So this summer, hopefully I'll be announcing something big.
Well, very exciting, and I guess all the more reason for people to go follow you on social media so they can be updated and made aware when that announcement is made and what you are going to be doing, because I'm sure it's going to be huge. And again, thank you so much for joining us. I've really enjoyed this, and I hope we get to see you again soon.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for having me.
That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.